First thing to specify is that there's no such thing really as canon in Tolkien.
Fool of a took! Throw yourself in next time and rid us of your stupidity.
Oh boy. Dr. Corey Olsen returns to defend the Rings of Power and says one of the most unbelievable things I've ever heard about Tolkien. You might remember him from a 2022 video IGN posted where he commented on the trailer for the first season, making wildly inaccurate statements about Tolkien's works, despite his apparent knowledge of them. My favorite remains his claim that Tolkien doesn't mention Merry's hair color, a thing Tolkien described when Theoden makes Merry his squire. Everyone can make mistakes, everyone can get details wrong or misremember things, but not as many times as Olsen did in that short of a video. That's not an accident, that's on purpose. And so is what he says in this short clip. I don't know what this is from. I probably should find the whole video, assuming this is cut down, but for the moment, this short clip is good enough to make my point, because it shows the mindset I think drove most of the changes for the Rings of Power. This is what Olsen claims.
First thing to specify is that there's no such thing really as canon in Tolkien. Tolkien's ideas were ever evolving.
No. That Tolkien edited his stories over the years doesn't mean there's no canon. Yes, Tolkien changed things, added bits here, removed bits there, but there are still core elements to his stories. Most of the changes were minor, and many of them are simply different drafts. This was Tolkien working out the kinks, getting the stories to the state he wanted or felt worked best. More importantly, they weren't meant for the general public and weren't released until after his death. Treating his drafts as proof that his stories have no canon would be like treating Da Vinci's rough sketches as proof that there is no definitive Mona Lisa. Even when Tolkien changed things after publication, he's the author, so he's the authority on what counts and what doesn't, whether or not anyone else likes it. We saw this with George Lucas changing things in the special editions of the original trilogy. His changes became canon because he's the creator. Yes, in the original theatrical release, Han shot first. In the special edition, they re-edited the scene and digitally moved him to the side to make it look like he shot second. Technically, the change is now canon. The same logic applies to Tolkien's works. Since he was the only one writing the stories, only his words count. Only he could decide what did and didn't happen. Now, there is some wiggle room with the drafts and retellings, because we could argue that later drafts were probably what Tolkien intended. But to make that argument, we need the specific version of the story, and Olsen doesn't provide that. We get no stories, no dates, no definitive changes. Instead, he makes vague assertions that, by pure coincidence, line up perfectly with the changes made in the Rings of Power. Total coincidence.
In the text of The Lord of the Rings, we are told that Gandalf, with the other wizards, arrived at around year 1000 of the Third Age. And in his later years, he was playing with the idea of maybe Gandalf coming sooner, maybe some of the wizards coming in the Second Age and taking part in the wars of the Rings of Power.
Where did he get that bit about Gandalf from? I've read most of Tolkien's works, some of them several times, but I don't have an encyclopedic knowledge of them, so maybe I missed something. Where did Tolkien write that Gandalf may have come to Middle-earth in the Second Age? I remember the parts about the blue wizards coming in the Second Age, but nothing about Gandalf. This is one of my problems with videos like this, because so-called experts can make claims, and even though they usually don't back them up with evidence, because they're called experts, the claims come across as true. But I have most of Tolkien's books, so if Dr. Olsen wants to tell me where I can find this claim about Gandalf arriving in the Second Age, I'd love to look it up. Now, for the second bit about the blue wizards, Olsen is right that Tolkien changed his mind about them and had them come in the Second Age. However, he's wrong that they took part in the Wars of the Rings of Power. What he says implies that the Blue Wizards fought in the wars, but that's not what Tolkien wrote. Tolkien changed their story so that the Blue Wizards arrived in Middle-earth sometime around the creation of the Rings of Power. They then went to the east and south and prevented Sauron from gathering enough forces from those regions to outnumber the Last Alliance. Technically, that helped defeat Sauron, but it's an indirect action. Tolkien never says the Blue Wizards were directly involved in the West with the War of the Last Alliance. I know that's nitpicky, but it is what Tolkien wrote. So no, the Blue Wizards didn't fight directly against Sauron. Then Olsen says something that the show blatantly contradicts, but, at least in this clip, he doesn't address the contradiction.
That same passage where he talks about his different names, he says, "To the east I go not." When we look at that quote in context, he's talking to a dude from Gondor, and the people of Gondor, they call Mordor the east. He meant, don't expect me to go throw down with, the Dark Lord at the gates of Barad-dûr.
Did he watch the show? Because the show kind of writes itself into that scenario. Not only has Gandalf gone east to Mordor, he's gone beyond it into Rhûn. Given his power, it implies that he'll eventually confront Sauron. The kicker is that none of the wizards are supposed to use their power in this forceful manner. They were supposed to guide the peoples of Middle-earth through persuasion. At any rate, Gandalf isn't supposed to be in the east at all, let alone with Tom Bombadil, let alone facing a dark wizard. Like I said in my review, if Gandalf is running around in the middle of the war, it makes no sense for him to remain in the east. However, if he goes back to the west, he'd need to act against Sauron directly, meaning physically fighting against the Dark Lord, as well as persuading people to join the Alliance, like he does in The Lord of the Rings. They can't up the ante like this and then have him do nothing. But by putting him anywhere near those battles, the showrunners fundamentally alter the story, and for no good reason, when the Blue Wizards were technically available. Olsen wraps up the clip by answering a question about Gandalf's purpose, saying what I said before. Gandalf's purpose is to help people through persuasion. But like I said, the show went in a completely different direction, focusing more on Gandalf's powers and the prospect of him fighting a dark wizard and Sauron. I really wish Olsen would have addressed that, but I suspect that this was a video made specifically by Amazon, so he's probably not allowed to question their changes, and if he did question them, Amazon would likely edit that out. That said, it's crazy for Olsen to claim that there's no Tolkien canon, as if Tolkien spent 50 years changing his stories so drastically that they were unrecognizable. He wasn't creating some kind of Middle-earth multiverse every time he rewrote something. He tweaked things, fleshed them out, reconsider his decisions, and then try again. Keep in mind that one of the reasons he did so many drafts was that when he would get stuck or change something, he would rewrite the entire story. His son Christopher mentions this in the books he edited, where he and others could see that his father had erased a previous version of a story written in pencil and then rewritten it in ink. Christopher and others would read as much as they could of the erasures and then added those versions to the History of Middle-earth books. Now, that's commitment. Also, that means Tolkien either wasn't good at erasing or had a very heavy hand. At any rate, if this is all Amazon can do to defend the lore-breaking changes made in the Rings of Power, clearly, they aren't sending their best. But what do I know? I'm just some guy.